The last entry Richard Byrd ever wrote in his personal journal was not dated. It carried no heading, no location marker, and no signature. It was placed face down on top of all the other pages before the binding was tied shut for the final time. That single unnumbered leaf has never been photographed. It has never been transcribed. And every institution that has ever been asked about it has given the same answer. It does not exist. But the man who sealed the journal said otherwise. He said Byrd told him personally what was on it. He said the words on that final page were not about Antarctica. They were about what Antarctica was built on top of, and then that man was told to stop talking. If this is your first time on this channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell. We cover the histories that never made it into the textbooks, and we are just getting started. Richard Evelyn Byrd became the most decorated explorer in American naval history. He flew over both poles. He led 5 major expeditions to Antarctica. He received the Medal of Honor. He appeared on the covers of newspapers across the Western world and was treated as a symbol of American ambition and scientific achievement. He was the kind of man whose life story was supposed to be fully documented, fully transparent, fully available for the public record. His papers were donated to institutions, his photographs were archived, his flight logs were preserved. Everything about Byrd, the official story insists, is knowable. And yet the journal from his final Antarctic expedition was sealed by direct order. Not classified in the military sense, not redacted or restricted through bureaucratic channels. Sealed, physically closed, bound and handed to custodians with instructions that certain portions were not to be reproduced or quoted without approval from a committee that, when researchers later tried to locate it, appeared to have no formal record of ever meeting. The one page that has ever been quoted publicly appeared in a secondary source, cited without image, referenced without context, and the passage selected was unremarkable. 3 sentences about weather conditions. That was the quote. That was all that was shared from a journal kept during months of polar operations by one of the most significant figures in 20th century exploration. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Byrd was actually doing during his expeditions. The public version is clean. He was mapping coastline, conducting atmospheric research, establishing American territorial presence on a continent that no nation formally owned. All of that is true. But the operational directives that governed his expeditions, particularly Operation High Jump in 1946 and 1947, have never been fully explained. High jump was not a scientific... I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Shifted multiple times over the decades, and the version currently accepted by mainstream sources does not match the after-action reports filed by participating officers, several of which describe engagement protocols that would only be relevant if the expedition anticipated hostile contact. Byrd himself said something strange when he returned. He gave a press interview in Chile before his ship reached American waters. And in that interview he described the possibility of an attack on the United States, from a direction that no conventional military threat could have come from at the time. He described aircraft of extraordinary capability, operating under conditions that eliminated any conventional propulsion explanation. He described a landscape beneath the ice that did not match any known geological survey, one that appeared to have been shaped by something other than glacial movement, and that exhibited features consistent with deliberate construction at a scale no publicly acknowledged civilization had ever attempted. He described the operation as something that had not gone as planned. He described men who had come back changed, not by the cold, not by the physical hardships of polar operations, but by what they had seen in the interior, in the places the maps marked as featureless white, and the sonar readings described as something else entirely. And then, when he arrived home, those statements were never addressed again. No journalist followed up. no congressional inquiry was opened, no official response was issued. The interview existed, was published, was translated, was circulated in several countries, and was then quietly removed from the category of things that serious people discuss. The Tartaria framework offers a way of understanding what Byrd may have encountered, and why every institution that touches his legacy has handled it with such precision. The civilization that modern researchers increasingly identify as Tartaria was not a regional power. It was a global architectural and energetic system. The evidence for it exists on every inhabited continent. Buildings constructed to standards that the 19th century could not have achieved independently. Energy harvesting infrastructure disguised as civic decoration, acoustic and electromagnetic properties embedded into structures that are now described as purely ornamental, and a consistent vision. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment. Now, then come back. Antarctica sits at the geometric center of that erasure project, not because it is the most significant location of Tartarian infrastructure, but because it is the location that was sealed most completely. Every other continent has been built over, repurposed, or partially excavated by populations that moved through afterward. Antarctica was not built over. It was locked. The ice sheet that covers the continent is not simply the product of gradual climate change. Ice core data from the deepest drilling operations reveals layer sequences that do not correspond to the slow accumulation model. There are strata that suggest rapid, catastrophic coverage over a landscape that was, at some point in the relatively recent past, temperate and inhabited. The structures visible in declassified satellite imagery along the Antarctic coastline are not geological formations. They follow the same proportional language as the Tartarian civic architecture identified on every other continent. They are too regular, too angular, and too consistently oriented towards specific astronomical alignments to be natural. Byrd knew this. That is what his expeditions were for. Not all of them, and not openly. But the men who authorized high jump knew that the mapping missions of the 1930s had returned data that did not belong in the scientific literature of the time. They knew that certain sonar readings taken in Antarctic waters described a submerged coastal shelf that contradicted the accepted geological history of the continent. They knew that Byrd's pilots had photographed terrain that the public maps did not include, and they authorized a military operation at the scale of a wartime campaign to go back and determine whether what had been found was isolated or connected, dormant or active, and most importantly, whether anyone else had already been there. Whatever they found, Byrd did not fully report it through official channels. His personal journal was the repository for what he could not file in an official report. The journal was the place where, throughout his career, he had recorded observations that fell outside the acceptable range of scientific documentation. His earlier journals from the 1920s and 1930s contain passages that describe geological anomalies which were quietly omitted from the published expedition accounts. Cross-referencing those journals against the published reports reveals systematic gaps, days where the journal contains substantial entries and the official record contains a single line noting routine operations. Those gaps cluster around specific geographic coordinates. Those coordinates, when mapped against modern satellite data, correspond to coastline features that are not on any publicly available Antarctic map. The final journal, from his last extended time on the continent, is the culmination of everything he had accumulated over 30 years of looking at what the ice was hiding. The people who sealed it understood that. They did not seal it because it contained security-sensitive military information. That information would have been handled through standard classification channels, and it was. What remained in the journal after the classified material was extracted was still sealed. That is the part that does not fit any conventional explanation. The personal observations of a private man written in a private document were controlled as if they contained something more dangerous than state secrets. The distinction the custodians drew was not between sensitive and public. It was between describable and not describable. Classified information can eventually be declassified. What Byrd had written was treated as something that could not, under any foreseeable institutional circumstance, be allowed to enter the describable category. The one page that was quoted, the 3 sentences about weather, was not selected randomly. It was selected to establish that the journal existed, that it was accessible in principle, and that its contents were mundane. That framing has held for decades. Researchers who have requested full access have been told that the journal is fragile and cannot be handled. Researchers who have requested digital scans have been told the journal has not been digitized. Researchers who have asked why a document of such historical significance has not been digitized have received no response. The logic of preservation, which in every other context is used to justify digitization and expanded access, has been inverted in this case. The fragility of the physical object has become the permanent reason why no one may see what is inside it. The account from the man who spoke about the final unnumbered page surfaced in the late 1970s, passed through a small number of researchers who documented it in newsletters and correspondence that predate the internet, and has been cited in Tartaria adjacent research as one of the most significant secondary testimonies in the entire body of evidence. The man's name is documented in those original sources. His professional connection to Byrd is documented. His account of the conversation in which Byrd described the final page is specific, detailed, and consistent across multiple tellings. He said Byrd told him that the page described what the land under the ice had been used for. Not what it looked like, what it had been used for. The distinction matters. Byrd was not describing geography. He was describing function. He was describing a system. The word Byrd reportedly used, according to this account, was the word that appears throughout Tartaria research when researchers describe the energetic infrastructure of the old civilization. It is not a word that would have meant anything to most people in Byrd's era. It is not a word that appears in conventional geological or architectural vocabulary. Its presence in Byrd's reported description, transmitted through a second-hand account that predates most modern Tartaria research by decades, is one of the structural reasons that researchers in this field treat the journal's sealing as confirmation rather than coincidence. He named what he found using a term that the system that erased Tartaria did not expect anyone to have carried forward. What you are left with is this. The most decorated Antarctic explorer in American history kept a personal journal throughout his final extended expedition. That journal was sealed before his funeral by people who understood its contents. One page of unremarkable weather observation was selected and quoted to establish that the journal was accessible and ordinary. Every subsequent request for access has been denied through procedural means that have no precedent in the archival treatment of comparable historical documents. A man who was present when Byrd sealed the journal reported that the final unnumbered page described the function of infrastructure located beneath the Antarctic ice, using terminology consistent with what modern Tartaria researchers identify as the language of the erased civilization. And every institution positioned to verify or deny that account has chosen silence. The choice of silence is not passive. It requires maintenance. Someone has to answer the access requests. Someone has to review the digitization proposals and decide again that this particular document is not ready. Someone has to brief the next generation of archivists on what the journal represents and why the standard protocols that apply to every other document in the collection do not apply here. That ongoing labor of suppression is itself evidence. Archives do not require active management to remain closed unless what they contain is considered alive in some operational sense. The Byrd Journal is being kept closed not because it records something that happened. It is being kept closed because of what knowing it would make possible. The ice holds what the history books were designed to prevent you from asking about." Byrd looked at it directly. He wrote it down. And the people who came after him understood that the most dangerous thing in that journal was not what he had seen. It was the fact that he had named it correctly. The name is still there, on a page that faces down, in a binding that has not been opened, in an archive that will tell you, if you ask, that there is nothing unusual inside. There are people still asking, and the silence that answers them is its own kind of complete record.